The Mystery at Number 7 by Mrs. Henry Wood. "Let's go and give her a turn," cried the squire. Todd laughed. "What, all of us?" said he. "To be sure, all of us. Why not? We'll start tomorrow." "Oh dear!" exclaimed Mrs. Todd Hetley, dismay in her mild tone. "Children and all?" "Children and all, and take Hannah to see them," said the squire. "You don't count, Joe. You'll be off elsewhere." "We could never be ready," said the mater, looking the image of perplexity. "Tomorrow's Friday. Besides, there'd be no time to write to Mary." "Write to her?" cried the squire, turning sharply on his heel as he paced the room in his nankeen morning coat. "And who do you suppose is going to write to her? Why, it would cause her to make all sorts of preparation, put her to no end of trouble. A pretty conjurer you'd make. We'll take her by surprise. That's what we'll do." "But if, when we got there, we should find her rooms are let, sir," said I, the doubt striking me. "Then we'll go into others, Johnny. A spell at the seaside will be a change for us." This conversation and the squire's planning out arose through a letter we had just received from Mary Blair, poor Blair's widow, if you have not forgotten him, who went to his end through that Gazette of Jerry's. After a few ups and downs, trying at this thing for a living, trying at that, Mrs. Blair had now settled in a house at the seaside and opened a day school. She hoped to get on it in time, she wrote, especially if she could be so fortunate as to let her drawing-room to visitors. The squire, always impulsive and good-hearted, at once cried out that we would go and take it. "It'll be doing her a good turn, you see," he ran on, "and when we leave, I dare say she'll find other people to go in. Let's see," picking up the letter to refer to the address, "number 6 Seaboard Terrace, Montpellier by Sea." Whereabouts is Montpellier by Sea? "Never heard of it in my life," cried Todd. "Don't believe there is such a place." "Be quiet, Joe. I fancy it lies somewhere towards Saltwater." Todd flung back his head. "Saltwater? A nice common place, that is." "Hold your tongue, sir. Johnny, fetch me the railway guide." Upon looking at the guide, it was found there. Montpellier by Sea, the last station before getting to Saltwater. As to Saltwater, it might be common, as Todd said, for it was crowded by all sorts of people, but it was lively and healthy. Not on the next Friday, for it was impossible to get ready in such a heap of hurry, but on the following Tuesday we started. Todd had left on the Saturday for Gloucestershire. His own mother's relatives lived there, and they were always inviting him. "Montpellier by Sea?" cried the railway clerk in a doubting tone as we were getting the tickets. "Let's see, where's that?" Of course, that set the squire exploding. What right had clerks to pretend to issue tickets unless they knew their business? The clerk in question coolly ran his finger down the railway list he had turned to, and then gave us the tickets. "It's a station not much frequented, you see," he civilly observed. "Travellers mostly go on to Saltwater." But for the train being due, and our having to make a rush for the platform, the squire would have waited to give the young man a piece of his mind. "Saltwater, indeed," said he. "I wonder the fellow does not issue his edict as to where people shall go and where they shan't." We arrived in due time at our destination. It was written up as large as life on a white board, Montpellier by Sea. A small roadside station, open to the country around, no signs of sea or of houses to be seen. A broad rural district, apparently given over entirely to agriculture. On went the whistling train, leaving the group of us standing by our luggage on the platform. The squire was staring about him doubtfully. "Can you tell me where Seaboard Terrace is?" "Seaboard Terrace," repeated the station master. "No, sir, I don't know it. There's no terrace of that name hereabouts. For that matter, there are no terraces at all. No houses, in fact." The squire's face was a picture. He saw that, save a solitary farm homestead or two, the country was bare of dwelling places. "This is Montpellier by Sea?" he questioned at last. "Sure enough it is, sir. Muntler, as it's called down here." "Then Seaboard Terrace must be somewhere in it, somewhere about. What a strange thing. "Perhaps the gentlefolks want to go to Saltwater," spoke up one of the two porters employed at the little station. "There's lots of terraces there. Here, Jim," calling to his fellow, "come here a minute. He'll know, say, he comes from Saltwater." Jim approached and settled the doubt at once. He knew Seaboard Terrace very well. It was at Saltwater, just out at the eastern end of it. Yes, it was at Saltwater. And there were we, more than 2 miles off it, on a broiling hot day when walking was impracticable, with all our trunks about us and no fly to be had, or other means of getting on. The squire went into one of his passions, and demanded why people living at Saltwater should give their address at Montpellier by sea. He had hardly patience to listen to the station master's explanation, who acknowledged that we were not the first travelling party that had been deluded in like manner. Montpellier, as he and the rest of the natives persisted in calling it, was an extensive straggling rural parish filled with farmlands. An arm of it extended as far as Saltwater, and the new buildings at that end of Saltwater had rechristened themselves Montpellier by Sea, deeming it more aristocratic than the common old name. Had the squire been able to transport the new buildings, builders and all, he had surely done it on the spot. Well, we got on to Saltwater in the evening by another train, and to number 6 Seaboard Terrace. Mary Blair was just delighted. "If I had but known you were coming, if you had but written to me." I would have explained that it was Saltwater Station you must get out at, not Montpellier, she cried in deprecation. "But, my dear, why on earth do you give in to a deceit?" stormed the squire. "Why call your place Montpellier when it's Saltwater?" "I do what other people do," she sighed. "I was told it was Montpellier when I came here. Generally speaking, I've explained when writing to friends that it is really Saltwater, in spite of its fine name. I suppose I forgot it when writing to you. I had so much to say. The people really to blame are those who named it so." "And that's true, and they ought to be shown up," said the squire. Seaboard Terrace consisted of 7 houses built in front of the sea a little beyond the town. The parlours had bay windows, the drawing-rooms had balconies and verandas. The 2 end houses, numbers 1 and 7, were double houses, large and handsome, each of them being inhabited by a private family. The middle houses were smaller, most of them being let out in lodgings in the season. Mary Blair began talking that first evening, as we sat together, about the family who lived in the house next door to her, number 7. Their name was Peaherne, she said, and they had been so very, very kind to her since she took her house in March. Mr. Peaherne had interested himself for her and got her several pupils. He was much respected at Saltwater. "Ah, he is a good man," she added, "but—" "I'll call and thank him," interrupted the squire. "I'm proud to shake hands with such a man as that." You cannot," she said. "He and his wife are gone abroad. A great misfortune has lately befallen them." "A great misfortune? What was it?" I noticed a kind of cloud pass over Mary Blair's face, a hesitation in her manner before she replied. Mrs. Todd Hetley was sitting by her on the sofa, and the squire was in the armchair opposite them, and I at the table, as I had sat at our tea-dinner. "Mr. Peaherne was in business once, a wholesale druggist, I believe, but he made a good fortune and retired some years ago," began Mary. "Mrs. Peaherne has poor health and is a little lame. She was very kind to me also, very good and kind indeed. They had one son, no other children. I think he was studying for the bar, I'm not sure, but he lived in London and came down here occasionally. My young maidservant Susan got acquainted with their servants, and she gathered from their gossip that he, Edmund Peaherne, a very handsome young man, was in some way a trouble to his parents. He was down at Easter and stayed 3 weeks, and in May he came down again. What happened, I don't know. I believe there was some scene with his father the day he arrived. Anyway, Mr. Peaherne was heard talking angrily to him. And that night he died." She had dropped her voice to a low whisper. The squire spoke. "Died? Was it a natural death?" "No. A jury decided that he was insane, and he was buried here in the churchyard. Such a heap of claims and debts came to light, it was said. Mr. Peahern left his lawyer to pay them all, and went abroad with his poor wife for change of scene. It has been a great grief to me. I feel so sorry for them." "Then is the house shut up?" "No, 2 servants are left in it, the 2 housemaids. The cook, who had lived with them 25 years and was dreadfully affected at the calamity, went with her mistress. Nice, good-natured young women are these 2 that are left, running in most days to ask if they can do anything for me." "It's good to have such neighbours," said the squire, "and I hope you'll get on, my dear. How came you to this place at all?" "It was through Mr. Locket," she answered, "the clergyman who had been so much with her husband before he died, and who had kept up a correspondence with her. Mr. Locket's brother was in practice as a doctor at Saltwater, and they thought she might perhaps do well if she came to it. So Mary's friends had screwed a point or 2 to put her into the house, and gave her beside a £10 note to start with. I tell you what it is, young Joe, if you run and reeve yourself into that scarlet heat, you shan't come here with me again." "But I like to race with the donkeys," replied young Joe. "I can run almost as fast as they, Johnny. I like to see the donkeys." "Wouldn't it be better to ride a donkey, lad?" He shook his head. "I've never had a ride but once," he answered. "I've no sixpences for it. That once Matilda treated me. She brings me on the sands." "Who is Matilda?" "Matilda at number 7, Mr. Peahern's." "Well, if you're a good boy, young Joe, and stay by me, you shall have a ride as soon as the donkeys come back." They were fine sands. I sat down on a bench with a book. Little Joe strained his eyes to look after the donkeys in the distance, cantering off with some young shavers like himself on their backs, their nursemaids walking quickly after them. Poor little Joe! He had the gentlest, meekest face in the world, with his thoughtful look and nice eyes, waited and watched in silent patience. The sands were crowded with people this afternoon. Organs were playing, dancing dolls exhibiting, and vessels with their white sails spread glided smoothly up and down on the sparkling sea. "And will you really pay the sixpence?" asked the little fellow presently. "They won't let me get on for less." "Really and truly, Joe. I'll take you for a row in a boat some calm day, if mamma will allow you to go." Joe looked grave. "I don't much like the water, please," said he timidly. "Alfred Dale went on it in a boat and fell in and was nearly drowned. He comes to mamma's school." "Then we'll let the boats alone, Joe. There's Punch. He's going to set himself up yonder. Wouldn't you like to run and see him?" "But I might miss the donkeys," answered Joe. He stood by me quietly, gazing in the direction taken by the donkeys. Evidently they made his primary attraction. The other child, Mary, who was a baby when her father died, poor baked pie, as we boys used to call him at Frost's, was in Wales with Mrs. Blair's people. They had taken the child for a few months, until she saw whether she should get along at Saltwater. But we thought she would get along at Saltwater. Her school was a morning school for little boys of good parentage, all of whom paid liberal terms, and she would be able to let her best rooms for at least 6 months in the year. "There's Matilda! Oh, there's Matilda!" It was quite a loud shout for little Joe. Looking up, I saw him rush to a rather good-looking young woman, neatly dressed in a black and white print gown, and a small shawl of the same, with black ribbons crossed on her straw bonnet. Servants did not dress fine enough to set the Thames on fire in those days. Joe pulled her triumphantly up to me. She was one of the housemaids at number 7. "It's Matilda," he said, and the young woman curtsied. And I'm going to have a donkey ride, Matilda. Mr. Johnny Ludlow's going to give the sixpence for me." "I know you by sight, sir," observed Matilda to me. "I've seen you go in and out of number 6. She had a pale olive complexion, with magnificent melancholy dark eyes. Many persons would have called her handsome. I took a sort of liking for the girl, if only for her kindness to poor little fatherless Joe. In manner she was particularly quiet, subdued, and patient. "You had a sad misfortune at your house not long ago," I observed to her, at a loss for something to say. "Oh, sir, don't talk of it, please," she answered with a sob of the breath.
I seem to have the shivers at times ever since. It was me that found him."
Up cantered the donkeys, and presently away went Joe on the back of one, Matilda attending him. The ride was just over and Joe beginning to enlarge on its delights to me, when another young woman, dressed precisely similar to Matilda, even to the zigzag white running pattern on the print gown and the black cotton gloves, was seen making her way towards us. She was nice looking also, in a different way, fair, with blue eyes and a laughing arch face. "Why, there's Jane Cross," exclaimed Matilda. "What in the world have you come out for, Jane? Have you left the house safe?" "As if I should leave it unsafe," lightly retorted the one they had called Jane Cross. "Back door's locked, and here's the key of the front," showing a huge key. "Why shouldn't I go out if you do? Come, Matilda, the house is none so lively a one now to stop in all alone." "And that's true enough," was Matilda's quiet answer. "Little Master Joe's here. He's been having a donkey ride." The two servants, fellow housemaids, strolled off towards the sea, taking Joe with them. At the edge of the beach they encountered Hannah, who had just come on with our own two children, Hugh and Lena. The maids sat down for a gossip, while the children took off their shoes and stockings to dabble in the gently rising tide. And that was my introductory acquaintanceship with the servant maids at number 7. Unfortunately, it did not end there. Twilight was coming on. We had been out and about all day, had dined as usual at 1 o'clock, not to give unnecessary trouble, and had just finished tea in Mrs. Blair's parlour. It was where we generally took tea, and supper also. The squire liked to sit in the open bay window and watch the passers-by as long as ever a glimmer of daylight lasted, and he couldn't see them so well in the drawing-room above. I was at the other corner of the bay window. The mater and Mary Blair were on their favourite seat, the sofa, at the end of the room, both knitting. In the room at the back, Mary held her morning school. I sat facing towards the end house, number 7, and I must here say that during the last 2 or 3 weeks I had met the housemaids several times on the sands, and so had become quite at home with each of them. Both appeared to be thoroughly well-conducted, estimable young women, but of the two, I liked Jane Cross best. She was always so lively and pleasant-mannered. One day she told me why number 7 generally called her by 2 names, which I had thought rather odd. It appeared that when she entered her place 2 years before, the other housemaid was named Jane, so they took to call her by her full name, Jane Cross. That housemaid had left in about a 12-month, and Matilda had entered in her place. The servants were regarded as equals in the house, not one above the other, as is the case in many places. These details will probably be thought unnecessary and uncalled for, but you will soon see why I mention them. This was Monday. On the morrow we should have been 3 weeks at Saltwater, and the squire did not yet talk of leaving. He was enjoying the free and easy life, and was as fond as a child of picking up shells on the sands and looking at Punch and the dancing dolls. Well, we sat this evening in the bay window as usual, I facing number 7. Thus sitting, I saw Matilda cross the strip of garden with a jug in her hand, and come out of the gate to fetch the beer for supper. "There goes Jane Cross," cried the squire as she passed the window. "Is it not, Johnny?" "No, sir, it's Matilda." But the mistake was a very natural one, for the girls were about the same height and size, and were usually dressed alike, the same mourning having been supplied to both of them. 10 minutes or so had elapsed when Matilda came back. She liked to gossip with the landlady of the Swan. She had her pint jug full of beer, and shut the iron gate of number 7 after her. Putting my head as far out at the window as it would go to watch her indoors, for no other earthly reason but that I had nothing else to do, I saw her try the front door and then knock at it. This knock she repeated 3 times over at intervals, each knock being louder than the last. "Are you shut out, Matilda?" I called out. "Yes, sir, it seems like it," she called back again, without turning her head. "Jane Cross must have gone to sleep." Had she been a footman with a carriage full of ladies in court trains behind him, she could not have given a louder or longer knock than she gave now. There was no bell to the front door at number 7, but the knock remained unanswered, and the door unopened. "Matilda, number 7's locked out," I said, laughing, bringing in my head and speaking to the parlour generally. "She's been to fetch the supper beer and can't get in again." "The supper beer," repeated Mrs. Blair. "They generally go out at the back gate to fetch that, Johnny." "Anyhow, she took the front way tonight. I saw her come out." Another tremendous knock. The squire put his good old nose round the window post. 2 boys and a lady passing by halted a minute to look on. It was getting exciting, and I ran out. She was still at the door, which stood in the middle of the house between the sitting rooms on each side. "So, you've got the key of the street, Matilda?" "I can't make it out," she said, "what Jane Cross can be about, or why the door should be closed at all. I left it on the latch." "Somebody has slipped in to make love to her. Your friend the milkman, perhaps." Evidently Matilda did not like the allusion to the milkman. Catching a glimpse of her face by the street gas lamp, I saw it had turned white. The milkman was supposed to be paying court at number 7, but to which of the 2 maids gossip did not decide. Mrs. Blair's Susan, who knew them well, said it was Matilda. "Why don't you try the back way?" I asked, after more waiting. "Because I know the outer door's locked, sir. Jane Cross locked it just now, and that's why I came out this front way. I can try it." She went round to the road that ran by the side of the house and tried the door in the garden wall. It was fastened, as she had said. Seizing the bell handle, she gave a loud peal, another and another. "I say, it seems odd, though," I cried, beginning to find it so. "Do you think she can have gone out?" "Sure, I don't know, sir. But no, it's not likely, Master Johnny. I left her laying the cloth for our supper." "Was she in the house alone?" "We're always alone, sir. We don't have visitors. Anyway, none have been with us this evening." I looked at the upper windows of the house. No light was to be seen in any of them, no sign of Jane Cross. The lower windows were hidden from view by the wall, which was high. "I think she must have dropped asleep, Matilda. Suppose you come in through Mrs. Blair's and get over the wall." I ran round to tell the news to our people. Matilda followed me, slowly, I thought reluctantly. Even in the dim twilight, as she stood at our gate in hesitation, I could see how white her face was. "What are you afraid of?" I asked her, going out again to where she stood. "I hardly know, Master Johnny. Jane Cross used to have fits. Perhaps she's been frightened into one." "What should frighten her?" The girl looked round in a scared manner before replying. Just then I found my jacket sleeve wet. Her trembling hands had shaken some drops of the ale upon it. "If she should have seen Mr. Edmund," the girl brought out in a horrified whisper. "Seen Mr. Edmund? Mr. Edmund who? Mr. Edmund Peaherne? Why, you don't surely mean his ghost?" Her face was growing whiter. I stared at her in surprise. "We've always been afraid of seeing something, she and me, since last May. We haven't liked the house at night time. It's often been quite a scuffle which of us should fetch the beer, so as not to be the one left alone. Many a time I've stood right out at the back door while Jane Cross has gone for it." I began to think her an idiot. If Jane Cross was another, why, perhaps she'd scared herself into a fit. All the more reason that somebody should see after her. "Come along, Matilda, don't be foolish. We'll get over the wall." It was a calm, still summer evening, nearly dark now. All the lot of us went out to the back garden, I whispering to them what the girl had said to me. "Poor thing," said Mrs. Todd Hetley, who had a kind of fellow feeling for ghosts. "It has been very lonely for the young women, and if Jane Cross is subject to fits, she may be lying in one." The wall between the gardens was nothing like as high as the outer one. Susan brought out a chair, and Matilda could have got over easily, but when she reached the top, she stuck there. I can't go on by myself. I daren't," she said, turning her scared face towards us. "If Mr. Edmund is there—" "Don't thee be a goose, girl," interrupted the squire, in doubt whether to laugh or scold. "Here, I'll go with you. Get on down. Hold the chair tight for me, Johnny." We hoisted him over without damage. I leaped after him, and Susan, grinning with delight, came after me. She supposed that Jane Cross had slipped out somewhat during Matilda's absence. The door faced the garden, and the squire and Susan were the first to enter. There seemed to be no light anywhere, and the squire went gingerly, picking his way. I turned round to look for Matilda, who'd hung back, and found her with her hand on the trellis work of the porch and the beer shaking over. "I say, look here, Matilda, you must be a regular goose, as the squire says, to put yourself into this fright before you know whether there's any cause for it. Susan says she's only stepped out somewhere." She put up her hand and touched my arm, panting like mad. Her lips were the colour of chalk. "Only last night that ever was, Mr. Johnny. As we were going up the staircase to bed, we heard a sound in the room as we passed it. It was just like a groan. Ask Jane Cross, else, sir." "What room?" "Mr. Edmund's, where he did it. She's heard him tonight, or seen him, or something, and has gone into a fit." The kitchen was on the right of the passage. Susan, knowing the ways of the house, soon lighted a candle. On a small round table was spread a white cloth, some bread and cheese, and 2 tumblers. A knife or 2 had seemingly been flung on it at random. "Jane Cross! Jane Cross!" shouted the squire, going forward towards the front hall, Susan following with a candle. It was a good-sized hall, I could see that, with a handsome well staircase at the end of it. "Hello! What's this? Johnny, Susan, all of you come here. There's somebody lying here. It must be the poor girl. Goodness bless my heart. Johnny, help me raise her." Still and white she was lying, underneath the opening of the staircase. Upon lifting her head, it fell back in a curious manner. We both backed a little. Susan held the candle nearer. As its light fell on the upturned face, the girl shrieked. "She's got a fit!" cried Matilda. "God help her," whispered the squire. "I fear this is something worse than a fit. We must have a doctor." Susan thrust a candlestick into my hand and ran out at the back door, saying she'd fetch Mr. Locket. Back she came in a moment. The garden gate was locked, and the key not in it. "There's the front door, girl," stuttered the squire in a passion, angry with her for returning, though it was no fault of hers. He was like one off his head, and his nose and cheeks had turned blue. But there could be no more egress by the front door than the back. It was locked, and the key gone. Who had done these things? What strange mystery was here, locking the poor girl in the house to kill her? Matilda, who had lighted another candle, found the key of the back gate lying on the kitchen dresser. Susan caught it up and flew away. It was a most uncomfortable moment. There lay Jane Cross, pale and motionless, and it seemed that we were helpless to aid her. "Ask that stupid thing to bring a pillow or a cushion, Johnny. Ghosts, indeed. The idiots that women are." "What else has done it? What else was there to hurt her?" remonstrated Matilda, bringing up the second candle. "She'd not go into a fit for nothing, sir." And now that more light was present, we began to see other features of the scene. Nearly close to Jane Cross lay a work-basket overturned, a flat open basket, 1.5 feet square. Reels of cotton, scissors, tapes, small bundles of work tied up, and such like things lay scattered around. The squire looked at these, and then at the opening above. "Can she have fallen down the well?" he asked in a low tone, and Matilda, catching the words, gave a great cry of dismay and burst into tears. "A pillow, girl, a pillow, or a cushion." She went into one of the sitting rooms and brought out a thick sofa cushion. The squire, going down on his knees, for he was not good at stooping, told me to slip it under while he raised the head. A sound of stalking feet, a sudden flash of light from a bull's-eye, and a policeman came upon the scene. The man was quietly passing on his beat when met by Susan. In her excitement she told him what had happened and sent him in. We knew the man, whose beat lay at this end of Saltwater, a civil man named Knapp. He knelt down where the squire had just been kneeling, touching Jane Cross here and there. "She's dead, sir," he said. "There can be no mistake about that." "She must have fallen down the well of the staircase, I fear," observed the squire. "Well, yes, perhaps so," assented the man in a doubtful tone. "But what of this?" He flung the great light on the front of poor Jane Cross's dress. A small portion of the gown body, where it fastened in front, had been torn away, as well as one of the sleeve wristbands. "It's no fall," said the man. "It is foul play, as I think." "Goodness bless me," gasped the squire. "Some villains must have got in. This comes of that other one's having left the front door on the latch. But I'm not sure that any of us, including himself, believed she could really be dead." Susan returned with speed and was followed by Mr. Locket. He was a young man, 30 perhaps, pale and quiet, and much like what I remembered of his brother. Poor Jane Cross was certainly dead, he said. Had been dead, he thought, an hour. But this could scarcely have been, as we knew. It was not, at the very utmost, above 25 minutes since Matilda went out to fetch the beer, leaving her alive and well. Mr. Locket looked again, but thought he was not mistaken. When a young doctor takes up a crotchet, he likes to hold to it. A nameless sensation of awe fell upon us all. Dead, in that sudden manner. The squire rubbed up his head like a helpless lunatic. Susan's eyes were round with horror. Matilda had thrown her apron over her face to hide its grief and tears. Leaving her for the present where she was, we turned to go upstairs. I stooped to pick up the overturned basket, but the policeman sharply told me to let all things stay as they were until he had time to look into them. The first thing the man did, on reaching the landing above, was to open the room doors one by one and throw his bull's-eye light into them. They were all right, unoccupied, straight and tidy. On the landing of the upper floor lay one or two articles which seemed to indicate that some kind of struggle had taken place there. A thimble here, a bodkin there, also the bit that had been torn out of the girl's gown in front and the wristband from the sleeve. The balustrades were very handsome, but very low. On this upper landing, dangerously low. These bedrooms were all in order, the one in which the two servants slept alone showing signs of occupation. Downstairs went Nap again, carrying with him the torn-out pieces to compare them with the gown. It was the print gown I'd often seen Jane Cross wear, a black gown with white zigzag lines running down it. Matilda was wearing the fellow to it now. The pieces fitted in exactly. The struggle must have taken place upstairs, not here, observed the doctor. Matilda, questioned and cross-questioned by the policeman, gave as succinct an account of the evening as her distressed state allowed. We stood around the kitchen while she told it. Neither she nor Jane Cross had gone out all that day. Monday was rather a busy day for them, for they generally did a bit of washing. After tea, which they took between 4 and 5 o'clock, they went up to their bedroom, it being livelier there than in the kitchen, the window looking down the side road. Matilda sat down to write a letter to her brother, who lived at a distance. Jane Cross sat at the window doing a job of sewing. They sat there all the evening, writing, working, and sometimes talking. At dusk, Jane remarked that it was getting blindman's holiday, and that she should go downstairs and put the supper. Upon that, Matilda finished her letter quickly, folded it, and directed her, and followed her down. Jane had not yet laid the cloth, but was then taking it out of the drawer. "You go and fetch the beer, Matilda," she said, and Matilda was glad to do so. "You can't go that way, I've locked the gate," Jane called out, seeing Matilda turning towards the back. Accordingly, she went out at the front door, leaving it on the latch. Such was her account, and I have given it almost verbatim. "On the latch," repeated the policeman, taking up the words. "Does that mean you left it open?" "I drew it quite to, so that it looked as if it was shut. It was a heavy door, and would keep so," was Matilda's answer. "I did it not to give Jane the trouble to open it to me. When I got back I found it shut and couldn't get in." The policeman mused. "You say it was Jane Cross who locked the back door in the wall?" "Yes," said Matilda. "She locked it before I got downstairs. We liked to lock that door early because it could be opened from the outside, while the front door could not be." "And she had not put these things on the table when you went out for the beer?" pointing to the dishes. "No, she was only then putting the cloth. As I turned round from taking the beer jug from its hook, the fling she gave the cloth caused the air out of it to whiffle in my face like a wind. She had not begun to reach out the dishes." "How long were you away?" "I don't know exactly," she answered with a moan. "Rather longer than usual, because I took my letter to the post before going to the Swan." "It was about 10 minutes," I interposed. "I was at the window next door and saw Matilda go in and come back." 10 minutes, repeated the policeman. "Quite long enough for some ruffian to come in and fling her over the stairs." "But who would do it?" asked Matilda, looking up at him with her poor pale face. "Ah, that's the question. "That's what we must find out," said Nap. "Was the kitchen just as it was when you left it?"
Yes, except that she had put the bread and cheese on the table, and the glasses and knives," added the girl, looking round at the said table, which remained as we had found it, "but not the plates." "Well now, to go to something else, did she bring her work basket downstairs with her from the bedroom when she remarked to you that she would go and put the supper on?" "No, she did not." "You're sure of that?" "Yes. She left the basket on the chair in front of her where it had been standing. She just got up and shook the threads from off her gown and went on down. When I left the room, the basket was there. I saw it, and I think," added the girl with a great sob, "I think that while putting the supper she must have gone upstairs again to fetch the basket, and must have fallen against the banisters with fright and overbalanced herself."
"Fright at what?" asked Nap. Matilda shivered. Susan whispered to him that they were afraid at night of seeing the ghost of Mr. Edmund Peaherne. The man glanced keenly at Matilda for a minute. "Did you ever see it?" he asked.
"No," she shuddered, "but there are strange noises, and we think it's in the house."
"Well," said Nap, coughing to hide a comical smile, "ghosts don't tear pieces out of gowns that I ever heard of. I should say it was something worse than a ghost that has been here tonight."
"Had this poor girl any sweetheart?"
"No," said Matilda.
"Have you one?"
"No, except Owen the milkman." A scarlet streak flashed into Matilda's cheeks. "I knew Owen. He was Mrs. Blair's milkman also." "I think Owen must be your sweetheart, or hers," went on Nap. "I've seen him, often enough, talking and laughing with you both when bringing the afternoon's milk round. 10 minutes at a stretch he stayed in this garden, when he need not have been as many moments."
"There has been no harm, and it's nothing to anybody," said Matilda.
The key of the front door was searched for high and low, but it could not be found. Whoever locked the door must have made off with the key. But for that, and for the evidences of the scuffle above and the pieces torn out of the gown, we should have thought Matilda's opinion was correct, that Jane Cross had gone upstairs for her basket, and through some wretched accident had pitched over the balustrades. Matilda could not relinquish the notion.
"It was only a week ago, that ever was, a week ago this very day, that Jane Cross nearly fell over there. We were both running upstairs, trying in sport which should get first into our bedroom, and in jostling one another on the landing, she all but overbalanced herself. I caught hold of her to save her. It's true, if it were the last word I had to speak."
Matilda broke down with a dreadful fit of sobbing. Altogether she struck me as being about as excitable a young woman as one could meet in a summer's day's journey. Nothing more could be made out of it this evening. Jane Cross had met her death, and some evil or other must have led to it. The police took possession of the house for the night, and Matilda, out of compassion, was brought to ours. To describe the mater's shock and Mary Blair's when they heard the news would be beyond me. All sorts of conjectures arose in the neighbourhood. The most popular belief was that some person must have perceived the front door open, and, whether with a good or an ill intention, entered the house; that he must have stolen upstairs, met Jane Cross on the top landing, and flung her down in a scuffle; that he must have then let himself out at the front door, and locked it after him. Against this theory there were obstacles. From the time of Matilda's leaving the house till her return, certainly not more than 10 minutes had elapsed, perhaps not quite as much, and this was a very short space of time for what had been done in it. Moreover, the chances were that I, sitting at the next window, should have seen anyone going in or out, though it was, of course, not certain. I had got up once to ring the bell, and stayed a minute or two away from the window talking with Mary Blair and the mater. Some people thought that the assassin, is it too much to call him so, had been admitted by Jane Cross herself, or he might have been in hiding in the garden before she locked the door. In short, the various opinions would fill a volume. But suspicion fell chiefly upon one person, and that was Thomas Owen, the milkman, though perhaps suspicion is too strong a word to give it. I ought rather to say doubt. These Owens were originally from Wales, very respectable people. The milk business was their own, and since the father's death, which happened only a few months before, the son had carried it on in conjunction with his mother.
He was a young man of 3 or 24, with a fresh colour and open countenance, rather superior in his manners and education. The carrying out the milk himself was a temporary arrangement, the boy employed for it being ill. That he had often lingered at number 7, laughing with the 2 young women, was well known. He had also been seen to accost them in the street. Only the previous day he and Matilda had stayed talking in the churchyard after morning service, when everybody else had left it, and he had walked up nearly as far as Seaboard Terrace with Jane Cross in the evening. A notion existed that he had entered the house on the Monday evening, for who else was it likely to have been? Cried everybody, which was, of course, logic. At last a rumour arose on the Tuesday, that Owen had been seen to leave the house at dusk on the fatal evening, that this could be proved. If so, it looked rather black. I was startled, for I had liked the man. The next day, Wednesday, the key was found. A gardener who did up the gardens of the other end house, number 1, every Wednesday, was raking the ground underneath some dwarf pines that grew close against the front railings, and raked out a big door key. About 15 people came rushing off with it to number 7. It was the missing key. It fitted into the door at once, locked and unlocked it. When the villain had made his way from the house after doing the mischief, he must have flung the key over amidst the pines, thinking, no doubt, it would lie hidden there. The coroner and jury assembled, but they could not make more of the matter than we had made. Jane Cross had died of the fall down the well staircase, which had broken her neck, and it was pretty evident she had been flung down. Beyond the one chief and fatal injury, she was not harmed in any way, not by so much as a scratch. Matilda, whose surname turned out to be Valentine, having got over the first shock, gave her testimony with subdued composure. She was affected at parts of it, and said she would have saved Jane Cross's life with her own, and no one could doubt that she spoke the truth. She persisted in asserting her opinion that there had been no scuffle in spite of appearances, but that the girl had been terrified in some way and had accidentally fallen over. When Matilda was done with, Thomas Owen took her place. He was all in black, having dressed himself to come to the inquest, and wearing mourning for his father, and I must say, looking at him now, you'd never have supposed he carried out milk pails. Yes, he had known the poor young woman in question, he readily said in answer to questions. Had been fond of chaffing with the 2 girls a bit, but nothing more, meant nothing by it, nothing serious. Respected both of them, regarded them as perfectly well-conducted young women. Was either of them his sweetheart? Certainly not. Had he courted either of them? Never thought of either of them as his future wife, should not consider a servant eligible for that position, at least his mother would not. Of the 2, he'd liked Jane Cross the best. Didn't know anything whatever of the circumstances attending the death, thought it a most deplorable calamity, and was never more shocked in his life than when he heard of it. "Is there any truth in the report that you were at the house on Monday evening?" asked the coroner. "There is no truth in it." "I see him come out of number 7. I see him come out of the side door in the garden wall," burst forth a boy's earnest voice from the back of the room. "You saw me not come out of it," quietly replied Thomas Owen, turning round to see who it was that had spoken. "Oh, it's you, is it, Bob Jackson? Yes, you came running round the corner just as I turned from the door." "You were there, then?" cried the coroner. "No, sir, at the door, yes, that's true enough, but I was not inside it. What happened was this. On Monday I had some business at a farmhouse near Muntler, and set out to walk over there early in the evening. In passing down the side road by number 7, I saw the 2 maids at the top window. One of them, I think it was Jane Cross, called out to ask me in a joking way whether I was about to pay them a visit. I answered, not then, but I would as I came back if they liked. Accordingly, in returning, I rang the bell. It was not answered, and I rang again with like result. Upon that, I went straight home to my milk books, and did not stir out again, as my mother can prove. That is the truth, sir, on my oath, and all the truth." "What time was this?" "I'm not quite sure. It was getting dusk." "Did you see anything of the young women this second time?" "Not anything." or hear anything, any noise?" "None whatever. I supposed that they wouldn't come to the door to me because it was late. I thought nothing else. I declare, sir, that this is all I know of the matter." There was a pause when he concluded. Knapp, the policeman, and another one standing by his side, peered at Owen from under their eyebrows, as if they did not put implicit faith in his words, and the coroner recalled Matilda Valentine. She readily confirmed the statement of his having passed along the side road, and Jane Cross's joking question to him. But she denied having heard him ring on his return, and said the door-bell had not rung at all that night, which would seem to prove that Owen must have rung during the time she had gone out for the beer. So you perceive the inquest brought forth no more available light, and had to confess itself baffled. "A fine termination this is to our pleasure," cried the squire gloomily. "I don't like mysteries, Johnny, and of all the mysteries I have come across in my life, the greatest mystery is this at number 7. It was a grand sea, one of the grandest that we'd seen at Saltwater. The waves were dancing and sparkling like silver. The blue of the sky was deeper than a painter's ultramarine. But to us, looking on it from Mrs. Blair's house in Seaboard Terrace, its brightness and beauty were dimmed. Matilda was to be pitied. The two young women had cared a good deal for one another, and the shock to Matilda was serious. The girl, now staying in our house, had worn a half-dazed look since, and avoided number 7 as though it had the plague. Superstition in regard to the house had already been rife in both the servants' minds, in consequence of the unhappy death in it of their master's son, Edmund Peaherne, some weeks back. And if Matilda had been afraid of seeing one ghost before, as she had been, she would now undoubtedly expect to see 2 of them. On this same morning, as I stood with the squire looking at the sea from the drawing-room window of number 6, Matilda came in. Her large dark eyes had lost their former sparkle, her clear olive skin its freshness. She asked leave to speak to Mrs. Todd-Hetley, and the mater, who sat at the table adding up some bills, for our sojourn at Saltwater was drawing to its close, told her, in a kind tone, to speak on. "I'm making bold to ask you, ma'am, whether you could help me to find a place in London," began Matilda, standing between the door and the table in her black dress. "I know, ma'am, you don't live in London, but a long way off. Mrs. Blair's told me so. Master Johnny Ludlow also, but I thought perhaps you knew people there, and might be able to hear of something." The mater looked at Matilda without answering, and then round at us. Rather strange it was, a coincidence in a small way, that we had had a letter from London from Miss Devine that morning, which had concluded with these lines of postscript: "Do you chance to know any nice, capable young woman in want of a situation? One of my housemaids is going to leave." Naturally, this occurred to the mater's mind when Matilda spoke. "What kind of situation do you wish for?" she asked. "As housemaid, ma'am, or parlour-maid. I can do my duty well in either." "But now, my girl," spoke up the squire, turning from the window, "why need you leave Saltwater? You'd never like London after it. This is a clear, fresh, health-giving place, with beautiful sands and music on them all day. London is nothing but smoke and fogs." Matilda shook her head. I couldn't stay here, sir." "Nonsense, girl. Of course, what has happened, and it's very distressing, and you of all people must feel it so, but you will forget it in time. If you don't care to go back to number 7 before Mr. and Mrs. Peaherne come home—" "I can never go back to number 7, sir," she interrupted, a vehemence that seemed born of terror in her subdued voice. "Never in this world. I would rather die." "Stuff and nonsense," said the squire impatiently. "There's nothing the matter with number 7. What has happened in it won't happen again. It's an unlucky house, sir, a haunted house," she contended with suppressed emotion, "and it's true that I would rather die outright than go to live in it, for the terror of being there would slowly kill me. And so, ma'am," she added quickly to Mrs. Todd-Hetley, evidently wishing to escape the subject, "I should like to go away altogether from Saltwater, and if you can help me to hear of a place in London, I shall be very grateful." "I will consider of it, Matilda," was the answer. And when the girl had left the room, the mater asked us what we thought about recommending her to Miss Devine. We saw no reason against it. Not but what the squire put the girl down as an idiot on the subject of haunted houses, and Miss Devine was written to. The upshot was that on the next Saturday Matilda bade farewell to Saltwater and departed for Miss Devine's, the squire sarcastically assuring her that that house had no ghosts in it. We should be leaving ourselves the following Tuesday. But before that day came, it chanced that I saw Owen the milkman. It was on the Sunday afternoon. I had taken little Joe Blair for a walk across the fields as far as Mumpler, there Montpellier by sea, you know, and in returning met Thomas Owen. He wore his black Sunday clothes and looked a downright fine fellow as usual. There was something about the man I couldn't help liking, in spite of the doubt attaching to him. "So Matilda Valentine's gone, sir," he observed, after we had exchanged a few sentences. "Yes, she went yesterday," I answered, putting my back against the field fence, while young Joe went careering about in chase of a yellow butterfly. And for my part, I don't wonder at the girls not liking to stay at Saltwater, at least in Seaboard Terrace. "I was told this morning that Mr. and Mrs. Peaherne were on their road home," he continued. "Most likely they are. They'd naturally want to look into the affair for themselves. And I hope with all my heart they will be able to get some light out of it," returned Owen warmly. "I mean to do my best to bring out the mystery, sir, and I shan't rest till it's done." His words were fair, his tone was genuine. If it was indeed himself who had been the chief actor in the tragedy, he carried it off well. I hardly knew what to think. It is true I had taken a bit of a fancy to the man, according to my customary propensity to take a fancy, or the contrary, but I didn't know much of him, and not anything of his antecedents. As he spoke to me now, his tone was marked, rather peculiar. It gave me a notion that he wanted to say more. "Have you any idea that you'll be able to trace it out?" "For my own sake, I should like to get the matter cleared up," he added, not directly answering my question. "People are beginning to turn the cold shoulder my way. One woman asked me to my face yesterday whether I did it. No, I told her. I did not do it, but I'd try and find out who did." "You are sure you heard and saw nothing suspicious that night, when you rang at the bell and couldn't get in, Owen?" "Not then, sir, no. I saw no light in the house and heard no noise." "You have not got any clue to go by, then?" "Not much, sir, yet, but I can't help thinking somebody else has." "Who is that?" "Matilda." "Matilda?" I repeated in amazement. "Surely you can't suspect that she was a party to any deed so cruel and wicked?" "No, no, sir, I don't mean that. The young women were too good friends to harm one another, and whatever took place while Matilda was out of the house. But I can't help fancying that she knows, or suspects, more of the matter than she will say. In short, that she is screening someone. To me, it seemed most unlikely." "Why do you judge so, Owen?" "By her manner, sir, not by much else. But I'll tell you something that I saw. On the previous Wednesday, when I left the afternoon milk at that tall house just beyond Seaboard Terrace, the family lodging there told me to call in the evening for the account, as they were leaving the next day. Accordingly, I went, and was kept waiting so long before they paid me that it was all but night when I came out. Just as I was passing the back door at number 7, it was suddenly drawn open from the inside, and a man stood in the opening, whispering with one of the girls. She was crying, for I heard her sobs, and he kissed her and came out, and the door was hastily shut. He was an ill-looking man, so far at least as his clothes went, very shabby. His face I did not see, for he pulled his slouching round hat well over his brows as he walked away rapidly, and the black beard he wore covered his mouth and chin." "Which of the maids was it?" "I don't know, sir. The next day I chaffed them a bit about it, but they both declared that nobody had been there but the watchmaker, Mr. Renison, who goes every Wednesday to wind up the clocks, and that it must have been him that I saw, for he was late that evening. I said no more, it was no business of mine. But the man I saw go out was just about as much like Renison as he was like me. And do you fancy—" "Please wait a minute, sir," he interrupted. "I haven't finished.
Last Sunday evening, upon getting home after service, I found I'd left my prayer book in church. Not wishing to lose it, for it was the one my father always used, I went back for it. However, the church was shut, so I couldn't get in. It was a fine evening, and I took a stroll round the churchyard. In the corner of it, near to Mr. Edmund Peaherne's tomb, they had buried poor Jane Cross. But 2 days before, you know the spot, sir, well, on the flat square of earth that covers her grave stood Matilda Valentine, the greatest picture of distress you can imagine, tears streaming down her cheeks. She dried her eyes when she saw me, and we came away together. Naturally, I fell to talking of Jane Cross and her death. I shall do as much as lies in my power to bring it to light, I said to Matilda, or people may go on doubting me to the end. And I think that the first step must be to find out who the man was that called in upon you the previous Wednesday night. Well, sir, with that, instead of making any answering remark as a Christian would, or a rational being, let's say, Matilda gives a smothered, sobbing shriek and darts away out of the churchyard. I couldn't make her out, and all in a minute a conviction flashed over me, though I hardly know why, that she knew who was the author of the calamity and was screening him, or at any rate that she had her suspicions if she did not actually know, and I still think so, sir. I shook my head, not seeing grounds to agree with Owen. He resumed. The next morning, between 9 and 10, I was in the shop, putting a pint of cream, which had been ordered, into a can, when to my surprise Matilda walked in, cool and calm. She said she'd come to tell me that the man I had seen leave the house was her brother. He had fallen into trouble through having become security for a fellow workman, had had all his things sold up, including his tools, and had walked every step of the way, 30 miles, to ask her if she could help him. She did help him as far as she could, giving him what little money she had by her, and Jane Cross had added 10 shillings to it. He had got in only at dusk, she said, had taken some supper with them, and left again afterwards, and that she was letting him out at the gate when I must have been passing it. She didn't see me, for her eyes were dim with crying. Her heart felt like to break in saying farewell. That was the truth, she declared, and that her brother had had no more to do with Jane's death than she or I had. He was away again out of salt water the same night he came into it. Well, didn't you believe her? No, sir, answered Owen boldly. I did not. If this was true, why should she have gone off in that smothered shriek in the churchyard when I mentioned him, and rush away in a fright? I couldn't tell. Owen's words set me thinking. I didn't know which of the two girls it was who let the man out that Wednesday night, for I didn't clearly see. But, sir, the impression on my mind at the moment was that it was Jane Cross and not Matilda. If so, why does she tell me this tale about her brother and say it was herself? And if it was Jane Cross? Owen shook his head. All sorts of notions occur to me, sir. Sometimes I fancy that the man might have been Jane's sweetheart, that he might have been there again on the Monday night and done the mischief in a quarrel, and that Matilda is holding her tongue because it is her brother. Let the truth be what it will, Matilda's manner convinces me of one thing, that there's something she is concealing, and that it is half frightening her wits out of her. You're going to leave Saltwater, I hear, sir, added the young man in a different tone, and I'm glad to have the opportunity of saying this, for I should not like you to carry away any doubt of me. I'll bring the matter to light if I can. Touching his hat, he walked onwards, leaving my thoughts all in a whirligig. Was Owen right in drawing these conclusions, or was he purposely giving a wrong colouring to facts and seeking craftily to throw suspicion off himself? It was a nice question, one I could make neither top nor tail of, but looking back to the fatal evening, weighing this point, sifting that, I began to see that Matilda showed more anxiety, more terror than she need have shown before she knew that any ill had happened. Had she a prevision, as she stood at the door with a jug of ale in her hand, that some evil might have chanced?
Did she leave some individual in the house with Jane Cross when she went to the Swan to get the ale, and was it her brother? Did she leave Owen in the house, and was she screening him? "Why, Matilda, is it you?" It was 14 months later, and autumn weather, and I had just arrived in London at Miss Devine's. My question to Matilda, who came into my dressing-room with some warm water to wash off the travelling dust, was not made in surprise at seeing her, for I supposed she was still in service at Miss Devine's, but at seeing the change in her. Instead of the healthy and, so to say, handsome girl known at Saltwater, I saw a worn, weary, anxious-looking shadow, with a feverish fire in her wild dark eyes. "Have you been ill, Matilda?" "No, sir, not at all. I'm quite well." "You've grown very thin." "It's the London air, sir. I think everybody must get thin that lives in it." Very civilly and respectfully, and yet with an unmistakable air of reticence, spoke she. Somehow the girl was changed, and greatly changed. Perhaps she had been grieving after Jane Cross. Perhaps the secret of what had happened, if in truth Matilda knew it, lay upon her with too heavy a weight. "Do you find Matilda a good servant?" I asked of Miss Devine later, she and I being alone together. "A very good servant, Johnny, but she's going to leave me." "Is she? Why?" Miss Devine only nodded in answer to the first query, passing over the last. I supposed she didn't wish to say. "I think her so much altered." "In what way, Johnny?" "In looks and manner. She's just a shadow. One might say she had passed through a 6 months' fever. And what a curious light there is in her eyes. She has always impressed me with the idea of having some great care upon her. None can mistake that she is a sorrowful woman. I hear that the other servants accuse her of having been crossed in love," added Miss Devine, with a smile. "She's thinner even than Miss Cattleton. And that, I dare say, you think need not be, Johnny. Miss Cattleton, by the way, is rather hard upon Matilda just now, calls her a demon." "A demon? Why does she?" "Well, I'll tell you. Though it is but a little domestic matter, one that perhaps you will hardly care to hear, you must know, to begin with, that Matilda has never made herself sociable with the other servants here. In return, they have become somewhat prejudiced against her, and have been ready to play her tricks, tease her, and what not. But you must understand, Johnny, that I knew nothing of the state of affairs below. Such matters rarely reach me. My cook, Hall, was especially at war with Matilda. In fact, I believe there was no love lost between the two. The girl's melancholy, for at times she does seem very melancholy, was openly put down by the rest to the assumption that she must have had some love affair in which the swain had played her false. They were continually plaguing her on this score, and it no doubt irritated Matilda, but she rarely retorted, preferring rather to leave them and take refuge in her room. Why couldn't they let her alone? People can't let one another alone, as I believe, Johnny. If they did, the world would be pleasanter to live in. And I suppose Matilda got tired at last and gave warning. No, some 2 or 3 weeks back it appears that by some means or other Hall obtained access to a small trunk, one that Matilda keeps her treasures in and has cautiously kept locked. If I thought Hall had opened this trunk with a key of her own, as Matilda accuses her of doing, I wouldn't keep the woman in my house another day. But she declares to me most earnestly, for I had her before me here to question her, that Matilda, called suddenly out of her chamber, left the trunk open there, and the letter, of which I am about to tell you, lying, also open, by its side. Hall says that she went into the room, it adjoins her own, for something she wanted, and that all she did, and she admits this much, was to pick up the letter, carry it downstairs, read it to the other servants, and make fun over it. What letter was it? Strictly speaking, it was only part of a letter, one begun but not concluded. It was in Matilda's own hand, apparently written a long while ago, for the ink was pale and faded, and it began, "Dearest Thomas Owen." "The Thomas Owen!" I exclaimed, starting in my chair. "Why, that's the milkman at Saltwater." "I'm sure I don't know who he is, Johnny, and I don't suppose it matters."
Only a few lines followed, 3 or 4, speaking of some private conversation that she had held with him on coming out of church the day before, and of some reproach that she had then made to him respecting Jane Cross. The words broke suddenly off there, as if the writer had been interrupted. But why Matilda did not complete the letter and send it, and why she should have kept it by her all this while, must be best known only to herself. Jane Cross was her fellow servant at Mr. Peaher's, she who was killed by falling down the staircase. Yes, poor thing, I remembered the name. But to go on, in the evening, after the finding of this letter, I and Miss Cattleton were startled by a disturbance in the kitchen. Cries and screams, and loud passionate words. Miss Cattleton ran down. I stayed at the top of the stairs. She found Hall, Matilda, and one of the others there. Matilda in a perfect storm of fury, attacking Hall like a maniac. She tore handfuls out of her hair. She bit her thumb until her teeth met in it. Hall, though by far the bigger person of the two, and I should have thought the stronger, had no chance against her. She seemed to be as a very reed in her hands, passion enduing Matilda with a strength perfectly unnatural. George, who had been out on an errand, came in at the moment, and by his help the women were parted. Cattleton maintains that Matilda during the scene was nothing less than a demon, quite mad. When it was over, the girl fell on the floor, utterly exhausted, and lay like a dead thing, every bit of strength, almost of life, gone out of her. I never could have believed it of Matilda. Nor I, Johnny. I grant that the girl had just cause to be angry. How should we like to have our private places rifled and their contents exhibited to and mocked at by the world, contents which to us seem sacred? But to have put herself into that wild rage was both unseemly and unaccountable. Her state then, and her state immediately afterwards, made me think, I speak it with all reverence, Johnny, of the poor people in Holy Writ from whom the evil spirits were cast out. Aye, it seems to be just such a case, Mr. Vane. Hall's thumb was so much injured that the doctor had to come daily to it for 9 or 10 days, continued Mr. Vane. Of course, after this climax I could not retain Matilda in my service, neither would she have remained in it. She indulged a feeling of the most bitter hatred to the women servants, to Hall especially. She had not much liked them before, as you may readily guess, and she said that nothing would induce her to remain with them, even had I been willing to keep her. So she has obtained a situation with some acquaintances of mine who live in this neighbourhood, and goes to it next week. That is why Matilda leaves me, Johnny. In my heart I couldn't help being sorry for her, and said so. She looked so truly, sadly unhappy. I am very sorry for her, assented Mr. Vane, and had I known the others were making her life here uncomfortable, I should have taken means to stop their pastime. Of the actual facts with regard to the letter, I cannot be at any certainty, I mean in my own mind. Hall is a respectable servant, and I have never had cause to think her untruthful during the 3 years she has lived with me, and she most positively holds to it that the little trunk was standing open on the table and the letter lying open beside it. Allowing that it was so, she had, of course, no right to touch either trunk or letter, still less to take the letter downstairs and exhibit it to the others, and I don't defend her conduct. But yet it is different from having rifled the lock of the trunk and filched the letter out. And Matilda accuses her of doing that, yes, and on her side holds to it just as positively. What Matilda tells me is this. On that day it chanced that Miss Cattleton had paid the women servants their quarter's wages. Matilda carried hers to her chamber, took this said little trunk out of her large box where she keeps it, unlocked it, and put the money in it. She disturbed nothing in the trunk. She says she had wrapped the sovereigns in a bit of paper, and she just slipped them inside, touching nothing else. She was shutting down the lid when she heard herself called to by me on the landing below. She waited to lock the box, but not to put it up, leaving it standing on the table. I quite well remembered calling to the girl, having heard her run upstairs. I wanted her in my room. Miss Devine paused a minute, apparently thinking. Matilda has assured me again and again that she is quite sure she locked the little trunk, that there can be no mistake on that point. Moreover, she asserts that the letter in question was lying at the bottom of the trunk beneath other things, and that she had not taken it from thence or touched it for months and months. And when she went upstairs again, did she find the little trunk open or shut? She says she found it shut and locked, just as she had left it, and she replaced it in her large box, unconscious that anybody had been to it. Was she long in your room, Miss Devine? Yes, Johnny, the best part of an hour. I wanted a little sewing done in a hurry, and told her to sit down there and then to do it. It was during this time that the cook, going upstairs herself, saw the trunk, and took the opportunity to do what she did do. I think I should feel inclined to believe Matilda. Her tale sounds the more probable. I don't know that, Johnny. I can hardly believe that a respectable woman, as Hall undoubtedly is, would deliberately unlock a fellow servant's box with a false key. Whence did she get the key to do it? Had she previously provided herself with one? The lock is of the most simple description, for I have seen the trunk since, and Hall might possess a key that would readily fit it. But if so, as the woman herself says, how could she know it? In short, Johnny, it is one woman's word against another's, and until this happened, I had deemed each of them to be equally credible. To be sure, there was reason in that. I sat thinking. Were it proved to have been as Matilda says, still I could not keep her, resumed Miss Devine. Mine is a peaceable, well-ordered household, and I should not like to know that one, subject to insane fits of temper, was a member of it, though Hall in that case would get her discharge also. Do the people where Matilda's going know why she leaves? Mr. and Mrs. Soames, yes, I told them all about it, but I told them at the same time what I had then learnt, that Matilda's temper had doubtlessly been very much tried here. It would not be tried in their house, they believed, and took her readily. She is an excellent servant, Johnny. Let who will get her. I could not resist the temptation of speaking to Matilda about this, an opportunity offering that same day. She came into the room with some letters just left by the postman. I thought my mistress was here, sir, she said, hesitating with the tray in her hand. Miss Devine will be here in a minute. You can leave the letters. So, you're going to take flight, Matilda? I've heard all about it. What a silly thing you must be to put yourself in that wonderful tantrum. She broke into my box and turned over its contents and stole my letter to mock me, retorted Matilda, her fever-lighted eyes taking a momentary fierceness. Who put in my place would not have gone into a tantrum, sir. But she says she didn't break into it. As surely as that is heaven's sun above us, she did it, Mr. Johnny. She has been full of spite towards me for a long time, and she thought she'd pay me out. I did but unlock the box and slip the little paper of money in, and I locked it again instantly and brought the key away with me. I can never say anything truer than that, sir. To make a mistake about it is not possible. No pen could convey the solemn earnestness with which she spoke. Somehow it impressed me. I hoped Hall would get served out. Yes, the wrong has triumphed for once. As far as I can see, sir, it often does triumph. Miss Devine thinks great things of Hall, but she's deceived in her, and I dare say she will find her out sometime. It was Hall who ought to have been turned away instead of me. Not that I would stay here longer if I could. But you like Miss Devine? Very much indeed, sir. She's a good lady and a kind mistress. She spoke very well indeed of me to the new family where I'm going, and I dare say I shall do well enough there. Have you been to Saltwater lately, sir? She added abruptly. Never since. Do you get news from the place? She shook her head. I've never heard a word from any soul in it. I've written to nobody, and nobody has written to me. And nothing more has come out about poor Jane Cross. It's still a mystery. And likely to be one, she replied in a low tone. Perhaps so. Do you know what Owen the milkman thought? She had been speaking the last sentence or two with her eyes bent, fiddling with the silver waiter. Now they were raised quickly. Owen thought that you could clear up the mystery if you liked, Matilda, or at least that you possessed some clue to it. He told me so."
"Owen as good as said the same to me before I left," she replied, after a pause. "He's wrong, sir, but he must think it if he will. Is he at Saltwater still?"
"For all I know to the contrary, this letter that the servants here got at was one that you were beginning to write to Owen.
"I would rather not talk of that letter, Mr. Johnny. My private affairs concern myself only," she interrupted, and went out of the room like a shot.
Had anyone told me that during this short visit of mine in London I should fall across the solution of the mystery of that tragedy enacted at number 7, I might have been slow to credit it. Nevertheless, it was to be so. Have you ever noticed in going through life that events seem to carry a sequence in themselves, almost as though they bore in their own hands the guiding thread that connects them from beginning to end? For a time, this thread will seem to be lost, to lie dormant as though it had snapped, and the course of affairs it was holding to have disappeared for good. But lo! up peeps a little end when least expected, and we catch hold of it, and soon it grows into a handful, and what we thought lost is again full of activity, and gradually works itself out. Not a single syllable, good or bad, had we heard of that calamity at Saltwater during the 14 months which had passed since. The thread of it lay dormant. At Mr. Veen's it began to steal up again. Matilda and her passion, and the letter she had commenced to Thomas Owen were to the fore, and before that visit of mine came to an end, the thread had, strange to say, unwound itself. I was a favourite of Mr. Veen's. You may have gathered that from past papers. One day, when she was going shopping, she asked me to accompany her, and not Miss Cattledon, which made that rejected lady's face all the more like vinegar. So we set off in the carriage. "Are we going to Regent Street, Mr. Veen?" "Not to-day, Johnny. I like to encourage my neighbouring tradespeople, and shall buy my new silk here. We have excellent shops not far off." After a few intricate turnings and windings, the carriage stopped before a large linen draper's, which stood amidst a colony of shops nearly a mile from Mr. Veen's. George came round to open the door. "Now, what will you do, Johnny?" said Mr. Veen. "I dare say I shall be half an hour here looking at silks and calico, and I won't inflict that penalty on you. Shall the carriage take you for a short drive the while, or will you wait in it, or walk about?" "I'll wait in the street here," I said, "and come in to you when I'm tired. I like looking at shops." And I do like it. The next shop to the linen draper's was a carver and gilder's. He had some nice pictures displayed in his window. At any rate, they looked nice to me. And there I took up my station to begin with. "How do you do, sir? Have you forgotten me?" The words came from a young man who stood at the next door close to me, causing me to turn quickly to him from my gaze at the pictures. No, I had not forgotten him. I knew him instantly. It was Owen, the milkman. After a few words had passed, I went inside. It was a spacious shop, well fitted up with cans and things pertaining to a milkman's business. The window board was prettily set off with moss, ferns, a bowl containing gold and silver fish, a miniature fountain, and a rush basket of fresh eggs. Over the door was his own name, Thomas Owen. "You're living here, Owen?" "Yes, sir. But why have you left Saltwater?" "Because, Mr. Johnny, the place looked askance at me. People in their own minds set down that miserable affair at number 7 to my credit. Once or twice I was hooted at by the street boys, asking what I'd done with Jane Cross. My mother couldn't stand that, and I couldn't stand it. So we just sold our business at Saltwater and bought this one here. And a good change it has been, in a pecuniary point of view. This is an excellent connection, and grows larger every day." "I'm sure I'm glad to hear it." At first mother couldn't bear London. She longed for the pure country air and the green fields, but she's reconciled to it now. Perhaps she'll have an opportunity soon of going back to see her own old Welsh mountains, and of staying there, if it pleases her. "Then I should say you're going to be married, Owen." He laughed and nodded. "You'll wish me good luck, won't you, sir? She's the only daughter at next door, the grocer's." "That I will." "Have you discovered any more of that mysterious business, Owen?" "At Saltwater? No, sir, not anything at all that could touch the matter itself. But I have heard a good bit that bears upon it." "Do you still suspect that Matilda could tell if she chose?" "I suspect more than that, sir." The man's words were curiously significant. He had a bit of fern in his hand, and his fresh, open, intelligent face was bent downwards, as if he wanted to see what the leaf was made of. "I'm not sure, sir. It is but suspicion at the best, but it's an uncommonly strong one." "Won't you tell me what you mean? You may trust me." "Yes, I am sure I may," he said promptly, "and I think I will tell you, though I have never breathed it to mortal yet. I think Matilda did it herself." Backing away from the counter in my surprise, I upset an empty milk can. "Matilda!" I exclaimed, picking up the can. "Mr. Johnny, with all my heart I believe it to have been so. I have believed it for some time now. But the girls were too friendly to harm one another. I remember you said so yourself, Owen." "And I thought so then, sir. No suspicion of Matilda had occurred to me, but rather of the man I had seen there on the Wednesday. I think she must have done it in a sudden passion, not of deliberate purpose. But now, what are your reasons?" "I told you, sir, as I dare say you can recall to mind, that I should do what lay in my power to unravel the mystery, for it was not at all agreeable to have it laid at my door. I began, naturally, with tracing out the doings of that night as connected with number 7. Poor Jane Cross had not been out of doors that night, and so far as I knew had not spoken to no one, save to me, from the window. Therefore, of her there seemed nothing to be traced, but of Matilda there was. Inquiring here and there, I, bit by bit, got a few odds and ends of facts together. I traced out the exact time, almost to a minute, that I rang twice at the doorbell at number 7 and was not answered, and the time that Matilda entered the Swan to get the supper beer. Pretty nearly half an hour had elapsed between the first time and the second. Half an hour! Not far short of it. Which proved that Matilda must have been indoors when I rang, though she denied it before the coroner, and it was taken for granted that I had rung during her absence to fetch the beer. And you knew, sir, that her absence did not exceed 10 minutes. Now, why did not Matilda answer my ring? Why did she not candidly say that she had heard the ring, but did not choose to answer it? Well, sir, that gave rise to the first faint doubt of her. And when I recalled and dwelt on her singular manner, it appeared to me that the doubt might pass into grave suspicion. Look at her superstitious horror of number 7. She would never go into the house afterwards." I nodded. "2 or 3 other little things struck me, all tending to strengthen my doubts, but perhaps they are hardly worth naming. Still, make the worst of it. It was only suspicion, not certainty, and I left Saltwater, holding my tongue." "And is this all, Owen?" "Not quite, sir. Would you be so good as to step outside and just look at the name over the grocer's door?" I did so and read, "Valentine, John Valentine." "The same name as Matilda's." "Yes, sir, it is," Owen said in answer to me. "After settling here, we made acquaintance with the Valentines, and by learnt that they are cousins of Matilda's. Fanny, my wife that is to be, has often talked to me about Matilda. They were together a good bit in early life, and by dint of mentally sifting what she said, and putting that and that together, I fancy I see daylight." "Yes?" "Well, Matilda's father married a Spanish woman. She was of a wild, ungovernable temper, subject to fits of frenzy, in one of which fits she died. Matilda has inherited this temper. She is liable to go into frenzies that can only be compared to insanity. Fanny has seen her in 2 only. They occur but at rare intervals, and she tells me that she truly believes that the girl is mad, Mr. Johnny, during the few minutes that they last." The history I had heard of her mad rage at Miss Devine's flashed over me. temporarily insane, they had thought her there. I said to Fanny one day when we were talking of her, resumed Owen, that a person in that sort of uncontrollable passion might commit any crime, a murder, or what not. Yes, Fanny replied, and not unlikely to do it either. Matilda has more than once said that she should never die in her bed. Meaning? Meaning what? I asked, for he came to a pause. Well, sir, meaning, I suppose, that she might sometime lay violent hands upon herself or upon another. I can't help thinking that something must have put her into one of those rages with Jane Cross, and that she pushed or flung the poor girl over the stairs. Looking back, rapidly recalling signs and tokens, I thought it might have been so. Owen interrupted me. I shall come across her sometime, Mr. Johnny. There are things that don't hide themselves forever, at least not often, and I shall tax her with it to her face. But don't you know where she is? No, I don't, sir. I wish I did. It was said that she came up to take a situation in London, and perhaps she's still in it, but London's a large place. I don't know what part of it she was in, and one might as well look for a needle in a bundle of hay. The Valentines have never heard of her at all since she was at Saltwater. How strange it seemed that she and they were living so near one another, and yet not to be aware of it. Should I tell Owen? Only for half a moment did the question cross me. No, most certainly not. It might be as he suspected, and with it all, I could only pity Matilda. Of all unhappy women, she seemed the unhappiest. Miss Devine's carriage bowled past the door to take her up at the linen-draper's. Wishing Owen good day, I was going out, but drew back to make room for two people who were entering, an elderly woman in a close bonnet, and a young one with a fair, pretty, and laughing face. "My mother and Fanny, sir," he whispered. "She's very pretty, very nice, Owen," I said impulsively. "You'll be sure to be happy with her." "Thank you, sir. I think I shall." "I wish you had spoken a word or two to her, Mr. Johnny. You'd have seen how nice she is." "I can't stay now, Owen. I'll come again." Not even to Miss Devine did I speak of what I had heard. I kept thinking of it as we drove round Hyde Park, and she told me I was unusually silent. The thread was unwinding itself more and more. Once it had set on a lengthening, I suppose, it couldn't stop. Accident led to an encounter between Matilda and Thomas Owen. Accident? No. It was this same thread of destiny. There's no such thing as accident in the world. During the visit to the linen-draper's above spoken of, Miss Devine bought a gown for Matilda. Feeling in her own heart sorry for the girl, thinking that she had been somewhat hardly done by in her house, what with Hall and the rest of them, she wished to make her a present on leaving, as a token of her goodwill. But the quantity of stuff bought proved not to be sufficient. Miss Devine had had her doubts upon the point when it was cut off, and she told Matilda to go herself and get 2 yards more. This it was, this simple incident, that led to the meeting with Owen, and I was present at it. The money order office of the district was situated amidst this colony of shops. In going down there one afternoon to cash an order, I overtook Matilda. She was on her way to buy the additional yards of stuff. "I suppose I'm going right, sir," she said to me. "I don't know much about this neighbourhood." "Not know much about it? What, after having lived in it more than a year?" "I've hardly ever gone out, except to church on a Sunday," she answered, "and what few articles I've wanted in the dress line I've mostly bought at the little draper's shop round the corner." Hardly had the words left her lips when we came face to face with Thomas Owen. Matilda gave a kind of smothered cry and stood stock still, gazing at him. What they said to one another in that first moment I didn't hear. Matilda had a scared look and was whiter than death. Presently we were all walking together towards Thomas Owen's, he having invited Matilda to go and see his home. But there was another encounter first. Standing at the grocer's door was pretty Fanny Valentine. She and Matilda recognized each other and clasped hands. It appeared to me that Matilda did it with suppressed reluctance, as though it gave her no pleasure to meet her relatives.
She must have known how near they lived to Miss Devine's, and yet she had never sought them out. Perhaps the very fact of not wishing to see them had kept her from the spot. They all sat down in the parlour behind the shop, a neat room. Mrs. Owen was out. Her son produced some wine. I stood up by the bookcase, telling them that I must be off the next minute to the post office. But the minutes passed, and I stayed on. How he led up to it, I hardly know. But before I was prepared for anything of the kind, Thomas Owen had plunged wholesale into the subject of Jane Cross, recounting the history of that night in all its minute details to Fanny Valentine. Matilda, sitting back on the far side of the room in an armchair, looked terror-stricken. Her face seemed to be turning into stone. "Why do you begin about that, Thomas Owen?" she demanded, when words at length came to her. "It can have nothing to do with Fanny." "I've been wishing to tell her it for some little time, and this seems to be a fitting opportunity," he answered, coolly resolute. "You, being better acquainted with the matter than I, can correct me if I make any blunders. I don't care to keep secrets from Fanny. She is going to be my wife." Matilda's hands lifted themselves with a convulsive movement and fell again. Her eyes flashed fire. "Your wife?" "If you have no objection," he replied. "My dear old mother goes into Wales next month, and Fanny comes here in her place." With a cry, faint and mournful as that of a wounded dove, Matilda put her hands before her face and leaned back in her chair. If she had in truth loved Thomas Owen, if she loved him still, the announcement must have caused her cruel pain. He resumed his narrative, assuming as facts what he had in his own mind conceived to have been the case, and by implication, but not directly, charging Matilda with the crime. It had a dreadful effect upon her. Her agitation increased with every word. Suddenly she rose up in the chair, her arms lifted, her face distorted. One of those fits of passion had come on. We had a dreadful scene. Owen was powerful, I of not much good, but we could not hold her. Fanny ran sobbing into her own door and sent in 2 of the shopmen. It was the climax in Matilda Valentine's life, one that perhaps might have been always looked for. From that hour she was an insane woman, her ravings being interspersed with lucid intervals. During one of those, she disclosed the truth. She had loved Thomas Owen with a passionate love, mistaking the gossip and the nonsense that the young man was fond of chattering to her in Jane Cross. She believed her love was returned. On the day preceding the tragedy, when talking with him after morning service, she had taxed him with paying more attention to Jane Cross than to herself. "Not a bit of it," he had lightly answered. He would take her for a walk by the seashore that evening if she liked to go. But whether he had meant it or not, he never came, though Matilda dressed herself to be in readiness. On the contrary, he went to church, met Jane there, and walked the best part of the way home with her. Matilda jealously resented this. Her mind was in a chaos. She began to suspect that it was Jane Cross he liked, not herself. She said a word or two upon the subject to Jane Cross on the next day, Monday, but Jane made sport of it, laughed it off. So the time went on to the evening, when they were upstairs together, Jane sewing, Matilda writing. Suddenly Jane Cross said that Thomas Owen was coming along, and Matilda ran to the window. They spoke to him as he passed, and he said he would look in as he returned from Muntpler. After Matilda's letter to her brother was finished, she began a note to Thomas Owen, intending to reproach him with not keeping his promise to her, and for joining Jane Cross instead. It was the first time she had ever attempted to write to him, and she stuck her work-box with the lid open behind the sheet of paper that Jane Cross might not see what she was doing. When it got dusk, Jane Cross remarked that it was blind man's holiday, and that she would go on down and put the supper. In crossing the room, work-basket in hand, she passed by Matilda, glanced at her letter, and saw the first words of it, "Dearest Thomas Owen." In sport she snatched it up, read the rest where her own name was mentioned, and laughingly began, probably out of pure fun, to plague Matilda. "Thomas Owen, your sweetheart!" she cried, running out onto the landing. "Why, he's mine! He cares more for my little finger than for—" Poor girl! She never finished her sentence. Matilda, fallen into one of those desperate fits of passion, had caught her up and was clutching her like a tiger cat, tearing her hair, tearing pieces out of her gown. The scuffle was but brief. Almost in an instant Jane Cross was falling headlong down the well of the staircase, pushed over the very low balustrades by Matilda, who threw the work-basket after her. The catastrophe sobered her passion. For a while she lay on the landing in a sort of faint, all strength and power taken out of her as usual by the frenzy. Then she went down to look after Jane Cross. Jane was dead. Matilda, not unacquainted with the aspect of death, saw that at once, and her senses pretty nearly deserted her again with remorse and horror. She had never thought to kill Jane Cross, hardly to harm her. She liked her too well. But in those moments of frenzy she had not the slightest control over her actions. Her first act was to run and lock the side door in the garden wall, lest anyone should come in. How she lived through the next half hour she never knew. Her superstitious fear of seeing the dead Edmund Peaherne in the house was strong, and now there was another one. But with all her anguish and her fear, the instinct of self-preservation was making itself heard. What must she do? How could she throw the suspicion off herself? She could not run out of the house and say, "Jane Cross has fallen accidentally over the stairs, come and look to her," for no one would have believed it to be an accident. And there were the pieces, too, she had clutched out of the gown. While thus deliberating, the gate bell rang, putting her into a state of the most intense terror. It rang again. Trembling, panting, Matilda stood cowering in the kitchen, but it did not ring a third time. This was, of course, Thomas Owen. Necessity is the mother of invention. Something she must do, and her brain hastily concocted the plan she should adopt. Putting the cloth and the bread and cheese on the table, she took the jug and went out at the front door to fetch the usual pint of ale. A moment or two she stood at the front door, peering up and down the road to make sure that no one was passing. Then she slipped out, locking the door softly, and carrying the key concealed in the hollow of her hand, she threw it amidst the shrubs at number 1. Now she couldn't get into the house herself. She wouldn't have entered it alone for the world. People must break it open. All along the way to the post office, to which she really did go, and then to the Swan, she was mentally rehearsing her tale, and it succeeded in deceiving us all, as the reader knows. With regard to the visit of her brother on the Wednesday, she had told Thomas Owen the strict truth, though, when he first alluded to it in the churchyard, her feelings were wrought up to such a pitch that she could only cry out and escape. But how poor Matilda contrived to live on and carry out her invented story, how she bore the inward distress and repentance that lay upon her, we shall never know. A distress, remorse, repentance that never quitted her, night or day, and which no doubt contributed to gradually unhinge her mind and to throw it, finally, off its balance. Such was the true history of the affair at number 7, which had been so great a mystery to Saltwater. The truth was never made public, save to the very few who were specially interested in it. Matilda Valentine is in the asylum, and likely to remain there for life, while Thomas Owen and his wife flourish in sunshine, happy as a summer's day.
If you like that story, consider supporting me as a patron. That way you help me make more stories for you and get access to a patrons-only library of stories. Lots more hours for you to listen to. So now it's time for me to say something about The Mystery at Number 7 by Mrs. Henry Wood. And first of all, I'll tell you, this is the normal format. I'll tell you something about her herself. So Mrs. Henry Wood born 1814. Ellen Price, she was born in Worcester in 1814, emerges as a prominent English novelist of the Victorian era under the pen name Mrs. Henry Wood. Her literary career began in earnest after her family's return to England from France, where they'd resided for 2 decades. The failure of her husband's business ventures necessitated her foray into writing as a means of financial support. That means he was broke, so she had to earn the money. Wood's most renowned work, East Lynne, was published in 1861. So we worked that out. So she's 39, yeah? 38, 39? Somebody will correct me. Catapulted her to literary stardom. Hear that? Stardom, establishing her as a household name not only in Britain but also internationally, particularly in the United States and Australia. Her prolific output, comprising over 30 novels, often featured conservative Christian themes and occasionally incorporated settlement elements of the supernatural. Wood's literary influence extended beyond her novels when she acquired the English magazine Argosy in 1867. As its editor and primary contributor, she shaped the publication's direction until her death in 1887, providing a platform for other notable female writers of the period. Her works garnered acclaim across linguistic boundaries, with translations appearing in French and Russian. Her literary prowess even caught the attention of the great Leo Tolstoy, who praised her novel In the Maze in a personal correspondence. Despite her immense popularity during her lifetime, which at times eclipsed that of Charles Dickens in certain regions, Wood's legacy has been somewhat overshadowed in contemporary literary discourse. That's a polite way of saying it, isn't it? I kind of hope that it'll work the other way around for me, that, and it does for some people, that when I'm dead and gone, people will discover what a literary genius I was. Maybe it won't happen. And I won't know any, or I might too. You just don't know. Anyway, I've got my fingers crossed. So Wood died on 10th February 1887. Her death happened in Upper Norwood. I tell you, I like to digress. I was reading a great book called Mischief Acts, which was set in the Great North Wood, i.e. Norwood. Zoe Gilbert wrote it, published it in 2022. I bought her next book, Folk, on the back of that because I really liked it. I'll be honest with you, there's not many books, modern books that I read now and I think, yeah, that was great. But I really enjoyed particularly the Puritan bit. But I liked it all of Mischief Acts. It follows Herne the Hunter in the Great North Wood. And I used to live down in Penge Way, which was, interestingly, is a Brittonic name, Pencoed. Penchet, it would have been in Anglo-Saxon, the way they borrowed it. They couldn't say k, so they said ch instead. So Pen became Penge. One of the few Celtic names left in, other odd ones in Kent, But anyway, and in Surrey, I think Berkshire's. Anyway, and the Chilterns possibly. I'm getting slightly sidetracked there. So the Great North Wood, which was a big wood. I was reading also. Beginning of this year, I read Ruskin's autobiography, the art critic Ruskin, and they lived in around Gypsy Hill and Denmark Hill and all that, and that was all part of the Great Wood. And even when he's talking in the early 1800s, there's lots of woodland there. It's all mostly being gobbled up now, which is a great pity in lots of ways. But so yeah, this is just my mind sparking. Because Ellen Price lived and died actually in Norwood. So other than that, all that excursion to Herne the Hunter and Zoe Gilbert is. But yeah, just if you like that kind of story, I would definitely recommend it. It's good. Anyway, where were we? So yeah, she wrote 30 novels, often featuring conservative Christian themes and occasionally incorporated elements of the supernatural. This could have been a ghost story, but clearly it wasn't. Her literary influence, she bought the English magazine Argosy. I already said that, 1867. She died in 1887 at the age of 73. Her son Charles Wood subsequently took over the editorship of the publication. So off it went. So among her notable contributions are the Johnny Ludlow stories, of which the Mystery No. 7, this story, is part. The stories were first published serially in Argosy before being compiled into book form. Smart move, buy the magazine, publish your own stories. In lots of ways, this is what I've done with my YouTube channel. I don't know if you've seen some of my recent ones on the Classic Ghost Story podcast. Yeah, this was my whole plan, and she did it and it worked for her. So yeah, it's a good plan. So yeah, we know that. So it was her works were translated. Mystery number 7. I've got my notes and my mind's skipping and my eyes are skipping. So they were first published serially in Argosy, made into a book. So Johnny Ludlow, great name. He sounds like a 1960s kind. He's like Johnny English, isn't he? A spy guy. Johnny Ludlow, Her Majesty's Secret Service. Anyway, this guy is a young man reflecting on mysteries and events from his youth, mainly in rural Worcestershire, where she was from. But this sounds, it's sort of, I don't know if it could be South Coast because they talk about going up to London, but people say going up to London from Oxford, even when they're going down to London. I never understood that. People talk about going up to town, you see. It's some kind of, it doesn't just mean geographically, it means elevating oneself, I suppose. I wondered if it was East Coast and wasn't sort of Norfolk, Suffolk coast, but I actually think it's South Coast. So, Brighton, Hove, all that kind of places. It's made up, isn't it? Montpellier, Mumpler. I thought that was funny because that's how it would be. It would be turned into some kind of rump pronunciation. There's loads of them around here that aren't. We've got a place called, it's written Torpenhow, but you pronounce it Trepenna. And Distington is Diziton. So, this is what local folk do. I'm sure they do it in the USA and, yeah, Australia as well. And other places. So, Johnny, what do I want to say about Johnny? So, he was published as a book after her death. So Johnny kind of ponders these things, and he's almost a frame character. Whereas he, in a frame story, the story is told to somebody. Usually there's a gentleman sitting. It's a big thing in Victorian and Edwardian stories. He's sitting in his club. Somebody comes in and says, I'll tell you something that happened to me. And the story. And then at the end, they go, that was rum do, what? And that's it. But Johnny's actually in the story. But he doesn't do very much. He just comments. And also the squire, what's he got to do with it? And I think this is actually a really interesting point about this story. She was famous. One of her most famous novels was East Lynne, and this was a sensation novel. So they were a genre fiction massively popular, particularly in the 1860s, but right through the 19th century. They combined elements of mystery, crime, and melodrama. I tell you who does them is Edgar Allan Poe, often focusing on shocking or scandalous events like murder, bigamy, or family secrets. There's this sensation stuff we've talked about, the common folks reading of the Penny Dreadfuls in the mid-19th century, but we've even got things like Schiller's The Ghost Seer, and then there's The Robbers, and so some of this came from German, but even things like in the late 18th century, what's his name, Lewis's The Monk, which was scandalous. So this sensation novel thing, it's for them. It's you know what I'm saying. We still do things like this, don't we? I mean, the internet now does this. TikTok now does this, and X, and even YouTube. We read these shorts, or we watch these shorts, and lots of them are sensation, aren't they? At least the ones they send me. That reminds me of that senator talking about TikTok, asking why all these unsavory and scandalous things were in his feed. Why did they send these things like that? And the guy explains, well, the algorithm knows what you like. It selects what you watch and it sends you more of it. So that was a funny thing. So maybe I get these sensation things because what I click on. Who knows? Anyway, so I think what I'm going to say is what I liked about this story and why. So we talk about the frame of Johnny Ludlow. But in a normal detective story, we have a sleuth, usually a super sleuth. Think of Sherlock Holmes, but most of them have a super sleuth. Lord Peter Wimsey, there's loads of that is the convention, and this super sleuth is a genius, and he comes in, usually Hercule Poirot, I mean, that's later, but it's still the same idea, and it begins in the Victorian period. And he comes in, and usually he, not always, and solves a problem with his or her remarkable intellect. Okay, we have that, and that's how they work. And most detective stories give us just the plot, the mystery. There's all sorts of subgenres, aren't there? The locked room, the inverted detective story, all of these kind of the puzzle story, which are related to those. But this departs from that. It gives us a lot more, and I think that's both its strength and its weakness. This is a woman who was a generalist, a very successful writer, but did all sorts of stories rather than just pure detective stories. And I think it shows. Perhaps you might say that the market for detective stories is what they want is that there's such a thing as genre expectations, and you find this even now. If you write a romance story, there are certain things that have to happen. The first dance, the first kiss, And if you write a horror story, there are certain things that have to happen. The revealing of the monster, the sin that allows the monster in. And if you write a detective story, etc., and a thriller, as I said before, I had the great privilege of interviewing Peter James about his new One of Us is Dead, his new thriller, detective thriller. And the thriller genre has expectations, and people buy the books because that's what they want. This is a long way of saying, I wonder if some people who were detective fans may have been disappointed by this story because it isn't just a detective story. It isn't just a mystery story. It's not particularly a detective story, is it? It is a bit, yeah. It is. But it's not just a pure detective story, is what I'm trying to say. So, because if it was, it would be different. We would have the sleuth come in. I've already said this. Bong. What she gives us as a generalist is she gives us a lot of extra detail. It's quite a long story. If you were going to make it a detective story, you could cut lots of stuff out, and probably pure detective fans would be happy with that. But at the very beginning, we get a lot of we learn about the railway system, how they end up at this station. And that relates to town planning and the growth of towns in the Victorian era, and the reliance on the railway system to get around. They didn't get in a car. Or even in this, they didn't get in the stagecoach. In previous generations, they would have used a stagecoach, or a post horses. They would have hired horses and gone. And even, as I said, Ruskin, when he's going across Europe, this is what they do. So the post horse system is you get your carriage, you hire some horses, they take you so far, then you go to an inn and you swap your horses, and you hire a new lot of horses, and you go to an inn and you swap your horses. And it struck me that those horses, like hire car these days, were probably brutalized. I don't mean brutalized in that, probably run to death. Like a hire car, they hammer it, don't they? And I wonder if post horses there's probably some. I remember Black Beauty being a bit like that. It made me cry, Black Beauty, when I was a kid, a lot. Probably made you cry if you were listening to it. Anyway, so we learn all sorts of stuff. We get a really many Victorian writers of ghost stories, detective stories. They don't know much about the working class, and they don't really give them anything other than mechanical roles. Think of Shakespeare's mechanicals. I know he's not Victorian, but you know what I mean. Think of M.R. James. The working classes that come into this are servants, and they're comic characters, really. But listen, Mrs. Henry Wood has those two maids. We know they're in mourning. Oh, that's another thing we learn. The Victorian mourning craze. The maids are in mourning because the member of the household has died. Thomas Owen is in mourning because his father's died, and they would wear mourning for a period. So we learn about that. We get the relationship between the two girls, and they are people for us. And Thomas Owen, who is a small businessman, although his mother won't let him marry a servant. And we get the class thing that plagues England to this day. And But we learn about it, and these are real people, and I think that's we get a lot of that. So we learn a lot about the Victorian period and the relationships and what it was like to live then, which we don't get in detective stories. So I think what I'm saying really is a detective story, if this had been a pure detective story, it would have been a lot shorter, probably sharper, different form, but we would have missed out on a tremendous amount. Now, if that's what we want, and I did, I loved learning about those things. The other thing is the psychological depth of, these characters are really, they're not just ciphers, are they? They're not just so-called flat characters. There is a school of writing that went back to then. It says, look, you don't want all your characters rounded. It's too distracting. Yeah, if you're going to do some psychological depth, make it into the main characters. There are other people who have walk-on parts. It's like if you went to see a play and the guy who came to deliver the letter, you have to learn his character arc. You don't want that. You want him to be a flat character. Fair enough. Now I'm going to contradict this and say, who isn't? The little boy with the donkeys, I think, he has a bit of a cameo, doesn't he? And we learn about him. And then we learn about the two maids. I think they need a bit of psychological depth, and Thomas Owen needs a bit of psychological depth. But she gives it. And in many detective stories, the bad guys are just bad guys. They're the black hats, aren't they? There's nothing to them. They're just wicked, born wicked, live wicked. But this story doesn't give us that. It gives us a young woman who is, it's a crime of passion. It was an unintended crime. It is a mystery. She withholds it till the end, so we don't find out till the end. And the other thing we do get, which is in common with the detective story, is the denouement at the end, where it is explained to us what happens. And so once old Matilda has gone mad and is in the asylum, she luckily has a lucid moment enough to explain what went on. Phew! If she hadn't, we would have been left hanging, wouldn't we? But I'm obviously joking. So yeah, but she's not a bad person. She's a very troubled young woman. And there is this theory that comes in that it's bred in the bone, isn't it? That, her fits are from her Spanish mother. That made me laugh. This Victorian idea that Latin types are impossibly and ungovernably emotional, which, of course, was the anathema to the Victorian stiff upper lip. I was reading an article this morning about how men didn't used to cry, but then they do now all over the place. And apparently, going back to Elizabethan times, this article said they used to cry then. But we had this period whereby men didn't cry, and you keep your emotions. It's a very, if you hate, I don't want to say it, but it's a very neat, tidy Protestant way. And she should be Catholic, wouldn't she? The Spanish woman. So this idea that you inherit this temperament. I thought, I used to be a psychiatric nurse until recently, and these rages whereby somebody loses the capacity to think. You see them. We had patients like that because they cause them a lot of problems, and we would label them with diagnoses, typically something like borderline personality disorder. Well, whether that's an actual condition or whether it's just a label because it didn't used to exist, until 50 years ago, and it's going out of fashion now. It gets called complex PTSD now. It may be that is actually a more accurate understanding of what's going on, but certainly one of the factors is this absolutely overweening emotions. I'll tell you, I used to train people in general hospitals on capacity. So mental capacity Act 2005 is about how in the UK, in England actually, England and Wales, how we work out as clinicians whether somebody has the mental capacity to make decisions about their own care. And if they don't, we then have to make decisions in their best interests. So sometimes, and I used to train midwives and accident and emergency clinicians, and I would say, okay, so clearly somebody maybe has got schizophrenia. You might think they don't have capacity, or you'd have to test every time though, and particularly about the decision. They may have capacity to go to the shop, but they may not have capacity to decide about who they're going to leave their money to, or these are complex decisions. And you may say somebody with dementia doesn't have capacity, but they may have capacity about some things anyway. To one side, there are more grey cases, and Matilda would be one of these. She later ends up in the asylum, so they've obviously decided she doesn't have capacity at that time to make decisions about her care and her life. These are very complex things, and they are things that society wrestles with still. I remember going to the USA and being astounded that people who were clearly psychotic were just wandering around the streets. And one way of looking at that is that you allow them the agency to live their lives, even though they're not living a life that I would want to live. And that is about individual freedom, and that is something to be praised. Or you could think of it as neglect. And I worked with a psychiatrist once, and we ended up sectioning a guy, so we forcibly treated him. He believed he smelled of fish, and we didn't hold him down or anything like that, but we kept him in hospital and wouldn't let him go. And he didn't smell of fish, but because this pervasive thought of that he smelled of fish, he avoided people. He lived a life that I wouldn't want to lead. And we could say, well, let's let him live that life. It's his. But the psychiatrist I was working with at the time said, no, we have a duty to try and treat him and make his life better. And I could see that argument as well. Actually, unfortunately, it didn't work. And after 6 months in hospital, he went back to live the life, still thinking he smelled of fish. So Matilda, so she has going back to my training. So I used to say to midwives particularly, say you have a mother and she gives birth and something goes wrong, she's bleeding and she's going to actually die unless you do something. And midwives have this big thing about birth plans, and the mother knows best, and they let her do what, that's the current fashion. It wasn't always like that. My mother was a midwife. It wasn't like that then. But it may be changing. I'm talking about a couple of years ago when I used to do this. But and I would say, so she says, and you need to do something to stop her bleeding out. What are you going to do? And she says, get off me. Does she have capacity? She has to have some kind of impairment of her thinking to fall even into the question of whether she has capacity. Because if you don't have any impairment of brain or mind, you automatically have capacity, even if you're making an unwise decision. So, is this an unwise decision? In which case, you're going to let her die, or are you going to intervene and, if necessary, by force, hold her down? Restrain her so that you can save her life. And it was interesting, their attitude. Some were like, no, it's her agency. I'm like, this woman's full of hormones, full of drugs. Is she really thinking straight? She's going to die. You better think quick, right? And the other one was more related to Matilda. Self-harm is prevalent with people with these deeply emotional problems, usually caused by very traumatic upbringings. Not always, but very mostly. And they would come in and they would have cut themselves, say, with a broken bottle. And you'd be talking to the clinicians then, and they say, they need to be stitched, they need to be sutured. Are you going to do it? Because if you decide they don't have capacity about that, you're allowed to restrain them and do it. And there's practicalities in that, of course. Sometimes things that are legal are not actually practical. Jumping to the side, we had a guy who had schizophrenia, a woman actually, and she'd been helicoptered in after being unresponsive after a big MI, big heart attack, and she didn't believe she had it. So the cardiologist said, well, we need to put a stent in, because if not, she's going to die. I've seen the clots. She's going to die. She would not have it. So the issue was, did she have capacity? Probably not. She didn't believe it. So we would be legally allowed. But as he pointed out to me, he said, you've got to take suppressant drugs afterwards. If she doesn't take them, she is going to die. So although it was legal for us to do that, we could have anesthetized her and stented her. Practically, it wasn't going to make sense. So the decision was that we were going to let her go. I don't know what happened to her actually. Fascinating areas, isn't it? So I was going back to the woman who's cut themselves, or the man who's cut themselves with a broken bottle. This is Matilda. Are the accident and emergency staff going to hold her down and suture her? Has she got capacity? And some of them would say, and it was really interesting, some would say, no, she hasn't. But there are practical issues. And others would say, "Oh, yes, she has. She's chosen to do that." And I can't. It is the clinician's decision about it. Nobody can be in as long as they can defend their clinical decision making, then that's fine. I mean, it doesn't mean fine. That's defensible. Yeah, if something happens, because sadly they have to just trying to help people, but they have to be wary of the fact that somebody probably sue them. Actually, probably not them, but the government, because the government's got more money, or the NHS has got more money. So very interesting. So that was a massively long digression about Matilda's mental state. And it started off as me complimenting Mrs. Henry Wood about her observation of this. There are people like this who are, there was a woman I worked with who tried multiple times to kill herself, and one particular time, and she was saying to me, she'd taken an overdose but left the door open so a neighbour could see, and was slumped at the table that the neighbour could see. So what does that say about, clearly, does she want to die or does she not want to die? Well, I think both. And she would explain to me that at the time she did these things, she absolutely wanted to die. Absolutely wanted to die. And it was like something had taken her over, like Matilda, when old Jane, young Jane, falls to her death. It wasn't intended. And I think that is a tribute to Mrs. Henry Wood. Her ability to write fuller characters than we get in most detective stories. Anyway, that's it for this week. Hope you enjoyed. Please share, please tell your friends, and I'll keep doing detective stories.